All right, let's get started. Welcome. Thank you for joining. I'm Leon Barnard, and my colleague Billy Carlson is also here in the chat as well. I'm going to be talking about user experience design, about user experience as a profession and about what it is. So there's no expectations that you have any knowledge about UX or that you're working in UX right now. So it's really basic. Yeah, and we should have some time for questions at the end, so hopefully it'll be useful for you. We are recording this, and we'll be sharing it to YouTube, but none of your information should be shown in the recording. It doesn't record anything but the slides and my voice. There is a chat and a Q&A, but I believe that there's options for those to be anonymous too, if you don't want to share your name with any of the other attendees. So yeah, this is going to be very basic. I'm going to start spending some time just talking about the software process. A lot of people come into UX not having a background in software, and it's a very unique industry, and it's really good to learn how software is made as kind of context and background for what UX is. So then I'll talk about what UX is, and then the different types of UX roles and what to do, and then a little insight into what working in UX is actually like. And then we'll do I'll share some more links if you want to learn more, and then we'll have time for questions as well. So a lot of people see software development like this. Someone had an idea for something, an app idea, a website idea, and then it obviously comes out as some code to turn it into that. But they don't really know what happens in the middle. But in a software company, it's a very complex process, and there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of pieces involved in turning that idea into code. And so I think it's really good to understand that a little bit before learning about what UX is and what a UX designer does, because they don't do everything. None of the roles in a company, do everything exclusively. So you need to understand the different roles, how they work together, because that's a big part of the job too, is working with the different roles. So this is something that's out there online, the 6 phases of the software development life cycle. And as you can see, it takes a lot of people to make software. You have somebody on the product or the business side that, whether it be a business analyst or a product owner or manager, and then goes through a design phase, and then development. So note that that's only 3 of the steps is coming from idea to building it. Then you have to test it. Then there's a whole separate phase for deploying it. A lot of software days, it's not just shipped on a CD-ROM anymore. It's constantly being updated. So you want to make sure that the servers are running, and that the new code doesn't break the old code. And then you need to maintain it. And what you do when you update versions, or people are using the older version, and you need to support that. So there's software is kind of an ongoing, living, breathing thing with a lot of different roles. So, if you don't know the software development process, it can really be surprising how many people are needed. So there can easily be 10 different jobs just working on one software project. So that role, the design phase, the second step there, that's pretty much where user experience lives. So who are those people listed in the design phase above? You see right here, you see a system architect, UX and UI designers. But it's also important to look at the people who participate in the design phase kind of in an adjacent or peripheral way. So, if we're kind of zooming in on that design phase, or that first half of the process, this is how I would describe it. So, you first need to identify what the problem is, and then you also need to understand it. Those are 2 distinct steps, and designing the solution. And then it's not enough just to come up with a solution, but you actually need to communicate it and kind of come up with a plan for how that's going to be built, and then building it. So a product manager and programmers or developers are the people that UX designers work with most, because there's clear overlap in those parts of the process. So these are the roles that UX designers work with most. So if I were to explain what user experience is very broadly, I would describe it this way. they are facilitating that process, that transition from idea to code. They're there to help bridge the gap between the business side and the technical side. And they use it by, they do it by using design skills and understanding the user of the product, thinking about how it works and what it does. And they think about creative ways to solve the problems and work with the business and technical roles to get everyone on the same page and get it built. And some of the things that they might think about and do, or they're thinking about usability, they're thinking about the information architecture. Is it structured in an ordered, logical way? How do people engage with it? Is it intuitive? What does it look like kind of at a zoomed out level beyond just the fonts and colors? And then the visual design, that plays a large role as well as far as how it feels and whether it's easy to understand. So even though there are so many specialized roles within the software industry, there are specializations within UX even. So here are some of the main types of UX jobs. The first one is what's usually called a UX designer, sometimes called a product or interaction designer. And this is probably what about 80% of the UX roles are, and what most people mean when they say they work in UX or they're a UX designer. They typically are the designer for the experience. But there's another role that's been around just as long as UX designer, and that's a user researcher, or also called a UX researcher. And I'll get into that. And then there are some emerging roles as well. So you can also be a UI or visual designer, and then a content designer, or also called a UX writer. It has some names as well. So there are various specializations within user experience, and I'll get into those a little bit later. So several of these slides come from a report from the Nielsen-Norman Group. It's founded by two pioneers in the UX industry, and it's really kind of the gold standard for research and information about user experience. So a lot of this is taken from there. They did a survey of UX designers and got a lot of information from them. So these are the most common responses to what a UX designer does, their skills: prototyping, visual design, research, and most desired skill, data analysis. I don't know if that's necessarily always going to be true. It's kind of a hot thing right now. So I don't know if I certainly don't think anybody needs to learn that to become a UX designer. And then as far as background, I will get into that more later, but you see a lot of different types of degrees, from graphic design, industrial design, visual communications, and I'll get more into that later. So what do these design roles, these UX designer roles, what does that look like? What kind of things do they make? Well, one thing they would do is they would help design a website. So they're not going to be the ones writing the code, and then if it's a website for Nike, they're not the ones designing the clothes or deciding what colors they come in or anything like that. But what they're thinking about is how to help a customer accomplish their goals. So in this case, the customer is interested in purchasing a piece of clothing. So that's their goal, is to find the right clothing for them. So what are some of the things that they might want to do on this page? The designer thinks about, well, they might want to buy it if they know just what they want, but also they might want to know what colors are available. They also might want to know, is it going to fit them or not? Is this does these sizes run large or small? Is it a loose fit? And what materials is it made out of? Where are they from? Where are they ethically sourced? So it's not just a matter of giving users a way to buy the product. Their goal is not just to buy a product. Their goal is to buy the thing that's right for them, and that includes learning about it as well. You might notice that next to the Add to Cart button, there's a little heart icon. So this is something that allows you to save it for later. This is something that's popular on a lot of e-commerce sites. And this is a good example of something that customers might not ask for, but maybe if you sit with customers and they have 20 tabs open on the Nike website, you might ask them about that, and they might say, well, I'm not going to buy all these things, but I just kind of want to have them open so I can browse them. And so kind of a UX way of thinking is, oh, well, maybe we could add a save for later feature, to address this, so people don't have to keep all these tabs open, or they can, if they're going to come back tomorrow, we store a list of these things that they're looking at. And so now let's look at how, so that's kind of what's on the site and some of the features and functions, but let's look at how the UX designer might have designed this page. So this is what's called a wireframe. It's kind of it's the same page, but in a wireframe version. It's kind of a skeleton of a page. So it removes the details like the picture and all of the specific descriptions. And so that you can focus on the interaction or the experience of the page. You know, it kind of strips away some of the visuals so that you're not just talking about the colors and the fonts and things that are really only part of the experience. And so as the interface or UX designer is thinking about the different thinking about this page, they're thinking about the different types of controls on the page, as well as the navigation. You know, can they get to where they want to go, and do they know where they came from on the page? You know, they're not just thinking about what's the best design for this one page, but you know, they're thinking about the entire site. You know, how to make it consistent across the site. You know, I think all of us have experienced going to a site or an app, and you go from one page to another, and it's suddenly like a different site altogether. You know, that's because there wasn't enough of this UX thinking of looking at the experience, and that's why the word experience is so key in the name. You know, your experience is much more than about just what one page looks like. For example, it's kind of this holistic experience. So this is one thing that UX designers are thinking about. You know, are all the different types of controls, are they the right controls? Are they designed the right way? And then you can kind of abstract it even more. You know, what if we just look at the page kind of as a series of objects or elements? You know, how do they fit together? If you abstract it this way, can you still kind of understand what's going on? What are the most important things? You know, even without the content, do you understand not only what's going on, but what you can do? You know, that big black bar, which is the add to cart button, you know, that kind of stands out, even though it's just black like the other things, but that's clearly something that's kind of drawing you to that. You know, that's the call to action button. That's what the designers are trying to guide you towards, which is to actually buy a product. You know, so if you've worked on a site that's translated or something, you know, you can be working on a website that's in Japanese or Arabic and still be thinking about the design by kind of abstracting those things away, and the design should still work at this level as well. So after that, so there's a series of steps where you're going through this wireframing phase and thinking about that level of detail, and then, you know, once you've refined that, you might move on to making like an interactive prototype. You know, so you're really dialing in more specific details, looking at some animations, adding some of the final graphics and colors and styles, how the pages connect together. You know, it gives a much more realistic, a full picture of what the overall experience is going to be like. And all this is done before coding starts. So it's still much faster than writing the actual code, even though it's a lot more involved than say, wireframing. So prototyping is something that UX designers do a lot when you get closer to the development kind of handoff phase. So zooming out more, all of this is kind of the creative process kind of demonstrated visually. It's this design funnel where in the beginning you start out with artifacts that have less detail, and then the trade-off there is that you create more of them. So you're really trying to get a sense of which ideas are good, what people like at a very high level, and then you're kind of narrowing down. So as you iterate more, as you get more and more, as you get closer to kind of more detail, you're kind of creating fewer artifacts so that you're narrowing down on one final design. You know, but in the early phases, you're just being creative. You're not trying to just come up with the one design and then you hand it off to the developers. It's a whole process. So that's why you might start with wireframes and then move on to the prototype when you get closer to that final idea. So now we'll move on to this UX or user research role. It's a very different type of role, but the common thread is the way of thinking. You know, they're still thinking about the user's experience, but this is more for people who don't really consider themselves or see themselves as designers. You know, you don't have to be good at drawing to be a UX designer. I was a UX designer, and I never really considered myself a very visual designer. But it's almost more like being a social scientist. you know, it's a lot of people have backgrounds in sociology or psychology, but it's still very much wrapped up in the user experience. You're just looking at it more, say, from the customer's perspective and trying to make sure that all of their needs are met with the product, even though you're not so much the one designing it. There are a lot of people doing this, but it's not nearly as popular as the other type of UX design. But more and more companies are starting to hire for this role, which I think is a really good thing, because these are people who are going to be talking to users and really finding out what their needs are. So almost all the large tech companies have this role, and now more smaller companies are starting to add it too. We just at Balsamiq, we're about 30 people, and we just started having a dedicated researcher. So it's kind of a step in the right direction for us, for sure. So what are some things that a user researcher might do, you know, as compared to a UX designer? This is something called a usability test plan. Something that user researchers often do is usability tests. So that means when you have a design that, you know, you've talked with everybody internally, you've talked to customers beforehand, you've done your research, and you think it's good, but you don't really know for sure. So when you have an idea, a concept, a prototype, you want to test it with people and see if it really accomplishes the objectives in the way that you imagine. So you might have people coming in and using a version of your product or a preview version of your product and seeing if they can actually do with it what you think that they want to do with it. They also might do some other kinds of usability tests where they follow a certain set of usability rules to see if the application kind of matches up with that. This is an example of something called a persona. It's something that a lot of user researchers create. This is not a real person. This is kind of this is a profile of a typical or an average user of a product. So what they'll do is they'll do a bunch of interviews with users and create kind of this persona, this profile of a typical type of that user. And what a lot of people don't really understand is that there's often a lot of different personas for even a single product, and that does make it hard to design for them, but it's really useful to think about the different types of people that are using them. So for example, on the Nike website, maybe you know, one persona would be a mom who has a bunch of kids and she's trying to buy clothes for school for them, for example. Or you might have other people who are training for a marathon and they need really, you know, serious active workout gear. So their goals are going to be very different. You know, one might be much more sensitive to price, others might be more interested in fashion, the others might be more interested in the performance. They might have different budgets, different you know, levels of comfort with technology, different ages. And so it's the more you talk to people, the more you start to see these kind of rise to the surface and you see some commonality. This is another thing that a user researcher might do. This is called a customer journey map. This is an example of somebody shopping for a new car, which if you've ever done it, it's really it's a long process. There's a lot of steps to it, and a lot of them have nothing to do with you know, the website. You know, but they might start with the phone and then move to the website, but then also talk to people at the dealership or call people on the phone. But for them, it's all part of the experience. And so what you don't want to do is just be thinking about everything in isolation. And, you know, you could have a great website, but, you know, you could have terrible customer service, or you're not replying to inquiries, or the site is really slow or something like that. So doing something like this, having a dedicated role that is just talking to customers, you can really see the process at a zoomed out level, because all of these things are what affects their experience and whether they buy your product or not. So it's not just about what it looks like, it's really that whole experience. So now I'll talk a little bit about some other UX jobs that are less common or that are emerging. One is a dedicated UI designer. They generally don't have as much knowledge about user experience, but they're going to be looking more at the visual design of things and the look and feel of the product rather than the workflow and the overall experience. But like I said, I wasn't a very good UI designer, so it can be good to have somebody in that dedicated role as well, especially if you have a big product or a big team. And then the second one is kind of a team of one or or sometimes called a unicorn. A lot of companies, when they're hiring their first UX designer, that person ends up doing a lot of different things. So they might do a little bit of research, UX design, maybe some visual design. They might even write a little bit of code. So that's often the case for companies who are hiring their first UX designer. And then some companies, they just want one person who does everything really well. So that's why that's kind of labeled as a unicorn, because it's so rare. It's very rare that one person is really, really good at all of these different things. So be a little wary if you see a job posting for that. And then lastly, user experience is expanding into the whole customer experience, which really has a lot to do with the words that you use both on your website and the names that you use for things inside of the app, and making sure that your marketing pages have some consistency with your documentation pages and all of these sorts of things. So there's emerging specialties that focus on writing within software, the words that are on the screen. And really this all represents the idea that UX is expanding more broadly. So it used to be focused solely on the user interface, but now it's really looking at kind of the end-to-end experience. So I like this graphic because it kind of visualizes this and also shows how the different roles fit in the different phases of the product. So a visual designer is going to be more involved at the end, whereas a researcher and the designer are going to be involved earlier on. So and then there's this kind of product designer or team of one that does a little bit of everything, in theory at least. So now switching gears a little bit to what the job market looks like for people who work in UX. I like this graphic because it explains something called UX maturity, which ties into this idea of UX expanding. When companies first adopt user experience or hire a UX designer, they're going to be more focused on the visual design. But as UX it grows within a company, and when they've had UX for a longer time, you start to see it as really a way of thinking that people who are not just in UX can do. So focusing on the user rather than just being focusing on the code or the product or the features is something that a lot of companies start to do as UX starts to kind of grow and expand within the organization. And we're in a period now where a lot of companies are becoming more UX mature. And so that's why there's a lot of opportunities for UX. So this is a quote that I read from last year that says that according to LinkedIn, that it's still one of the top 5 in-demand skills for 2021, and it will continue to grow. So, the good news is that increasing UX maturity means more UX jobs, both different types and quantity. And it's not just working for the big tech companies that have UX designers. This is a listing I saw a while ago for Chipotle, it's a fast food restaurant. So you think, well, why would they have a UX designer? They make food, but they also have an app. They have a website. They may have some internal ordering system. And these days, every company has a website. A lot of companies have an app, and even more companies that are very, very large companies that you've never heard of, they have internal applications for tracking inventory or shipments or communicating with suppliers or doing HR or something like that. And all of those, the more usable those are, the more efficiently the company is able to run. So there's jobs across all industries in user experience, which is a really great thing. So you don't just have to work for Google or Facebook. And this is a new website, a relatively new website called Working in Content. And all it does is have jobs that are related to this new emerging field of UX writing, content strategy. It has a bunch of different names, but things where you're thinking about the words that are on the screen, the wording that you use really matters to the experience. So this site, I checked yesterday, it had 431 jobs just in this field of content design, which is a very narrow specialization within user experience. So that's another good way to get into UX design, even if you want to become a designer or a researcher, but say you have a good background in writing, you could become a UX writer, and then you're on a UX team, even though you have no background in design, but that's something you can learn on the job. And there's more good news. UX generally pays quite well. Here's an image from a few years ago showing some of the different salaries in different regions across the country. It varies, by region, both within the US and outside of the US. It varies by seniority and specialization, years of experience, things like that. But you can easily make a six-figure salary in a big city in America. It's comparable to a lot of other tech jobs. Maybe not as much as a programmer or product manager, but generally you can make a pretty good living doing it, and it's typically not a very high stress job, which is good. So looking at this report, which some of this information was taken from the Nielsen Norman Group, I wanted to pull out a few quotes from that really kind of capture what it's like working as a UX designer. And this is a link to that report. It's a really long PDF document that's a good read if you want to learn more. But I'm just going to pull out some of the highlights from it. So a big question, probably the number one question is, do I need a specific degree? What if I have a degree in some unrelated field? Or what if I don't have a degree? Or what if I'm, went to college a long time ago? Do I need to go back to school? Well, so let's dive into that. And we'll look at some of the quotes from that report. This is a good one to start with. Don't worry so much about your background. I've met UX professionals that come from all sorts of backgrounds, from finance to anthropology. You don't need a special degree to get into that field. It's true for me. I had an engineering degree. My colleague Billy majored in graphic design. And even these days, most people who work in UX don't have a specialized UX degree in it. There's still very few 2- and 4-year university programs in UX design. So very few people really have a university education in user experience design. Here's another quote. My background in graphic design helped immensely to have as a hard skill because it was easier to get a foot in the door. So there's a lot of people trying to get in UX. So having some kind of related degree can definitely help. But like I said, it's not required. And this sums it up pretty well, I think. Since a somewhat accidental discovery of UX seems to be fairly common, it's quite possible for anyone to work in the field given a level of interest and a certain temperament. A lot of people discover UX accidentally. Maybe you're discovering UX accidentally just by coming to this talk. So I think really, if you're interested in it, and you have kind of the right, temperament or way of thinking for it, that's the most important thing. Some more statistics about the type of education. So 82% of UX employees had a university degree at all. So that means that a lot of, a fifth of them never even went to university. Less than half of them designers had a degree in some kind of design, and less than a quarter of user researchers had a degree in sociology or psychology, which is probably the most common educational background for a user researcher. So for people without a UX degree, how do they learn? More than half of them did some kind of online courses. So most people have some kind of training, but as you can see, a lot of them are some kind of certificate or online courses, things that you can do part-time or in your free time, not something that's having to do with going to a full-time in-person education. But most UX designers will have done some kind of training before getting hired, but that's frequently done online. So what are some of the skills that a UX designer or UX employee needs to have? This is also from that report. What's interesting is that the soft skills are the most important part of the job, I think. In particular, being a good communicator, being empathetic, being able to understand the perspective of the customer and advocate for them in the development process. Those are really the things that are going to make you stand out and successful in the field. A lot of the hard skills you can learn on the job. Here's an article that I wrote a couple of years ago about some of those soft skills that I think are most important, and I'll add a link to this at the end. This was a tweet I saw just about a week ago about content design, which I think is also very true for the other UX roles. What people would imagine that a content designer would do, they'd be somebody who just writes all the time, but what that role actually looks like, and this was shared by a content designer. They're doing things like educating and building advocacy. They're doing some design. They're doing a little bit of writing, and they're spending time on strategy and operations. You know, all of these are soft skills and non-technical skills that you need in the role. And this is from an article I wrote a few years ago about what it was like for me getting into the industry. What I thought the job would be spending a lot of time designing and coming up with this great, awesome design, and then, you know, sending a few emails to the programmers and having them build it. But what I found is that that step of negotiating and working with the team to get it built and making sure it's the right thing, that was a bigger part of the job than doing the design itself. Here's some more things from that report. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about UX design is that you need to, especially for people who are unfamiliar with it, is that you need to know how to program or write code. But you can see that both for designers and researchers, the skill that they feel that they need the least is computer programming. And some of the top ones are, you know, for designers, it's prototyping and doing some kind of research or project management. And then for a researcher, it's doing research and having the ability to write, to facilitate, to communicate, you know, some of those soft skills as well. And here's another quote from that guide. You probably have more relevant skills than you think. Anyone who's worked in customer service and done it well, who can understand what people want or need and communicate that effectively, whether verbally or by design, already has a great starting point for a career in this field. So if you want something that's encouraging, and you know, because you feel like you don't have the skills for the job, you know, think about this, that there's so many things that you've learned in whatever job or whatever experience you've had in life that could actually be preparing you very well. So what are some of the drawbacks, some of the frustrations of the role? You know, it's not perfect. Here's a few that I felt were the most true, the most relevant. Here's the number one complaint. How can I get the job in Silicon Valley or wherever when I'm fresh out of college and every single company wants 5 to 10 years of experience? This is almost every junior designer or aspiring designer is going to say this at some point. And really what it means is that you have to find a way to stand out. You know, the good news is that it's not necessarily about the UX skills you have. It's about being able to sell yourself, find the connections, and understand what the employer is looking for, so you can make sure that you're a good match. Another frustration is that UX is very misunderstood and is often confused with user interface. A lot of the time is just spent educating employers and teammates instead of actually doing the UX. And UX is something it's not always understood very well in different companies and by different roles. So that can be a big part of the role, unfortunately, is just explaining that your job is not just to make something look pretty. And then one last one, someone says, I work at a place where UX is a buzzword to be bragged with, but it's often an area that keeps being forgotten in development processes. When it is included, it is always prioritized the lowest. A lot of companies are still very development driven. They're kind of driven by programmers. They're thinking about features. They're thinking about, you know, selling certain features to customers. And so they might talk about UX, but it looks very different inside. And that's definitely changing. But in a lot of larger or older companies, that's still going to be the case. So I'll leave you with one more quote. And this is, I think, captures everything well, that the good news is also the bad news. This quote says, I would say to anyone looking to get into UX, there's not going to be a career path like law or medicine where you do X, Y, Z, and you end up there. It's really up to you right now to really form your education. That education can be formal or informal. I think that's a really good one to leave with. Everyone takes a different path to UX. The great news is that it's open to all different kinds of people from all different places and backgrounds, but you're going to have to work hard. You're going to have to hustle. You're going to have to find a way to stand out. It's not just taking a bunch of courses and then getting a job. There's a lot of competition. You have to find a way to stand out, and you're going to have to do a lot of work outside of just that skill set to make sure that you get yourself into the role. But usually once you're in, then it's very easy to continue you know, in the role, whether within a company or move to other companies. But getting into it is definitely always a big challenge, and it's a lot of work. So I will leave you with just a few links for some things that you can do research on your own later. And I'll share these afterwards as well when we post the recording. And then we'll have time for questions too. So we wrote a page on our website, on our Balsamiq Wireframing Academy site, which is part of the Balsamiq website, with advice for getting started in UX design. It talks about not only UX education, but the different, it goes into some of the different jobs that I described, and then how to get that first job and how to design your portfolio. A few more links. I found a few articles about how to choose a design career path, some letters that new UX designers wrote to their former selves, or what they would say to aspiring or new designers. There's a couple of internships out there. There's not that many, but there's a few links to ones that I was able to find. And then there's that report about what a UX career looks like. A few of the big books that are popular. There's a bunch more that I'm sure you can look up. A couple of sites for mentorship, specifically for these design roles. And then just a few ways to kind of like do some networking. There's hackathons, especially if you're in a university program, and sometimes they're looking for people who are designers as well. And then here's the LinkedIn addresses for myself and my colleague Billy. You're welcome to connect with us. We have a lot of contacts. We can answer questions, things like that. So, and again, all of these links I'll add to our site when we upload the webinar. So now I will have about 20 minutes left, and so I will leave this open to questions that anybody have. Yes, questions at the end, please. Thank you for listening, everyone, by the way. Okay, okay, one person wrote, if I major in computer science, is it still possible to have a UX career? Yes, absolutely. Computer science is a good, sometimes you can specialize in something adjacent to UX. So if you have a background in anything software related, whether that's on the business side, marketing side, or programming side, it can be nice to have that skill as well. It's especially useful for talking with developers. They often assume that UX designers don't know anything about the code, but so if you have a little bit of knowledge, that can be really helpful. Another one of your slides used the phrase UX developer. That is often a term that it's not used very often anymore. That might refer to somebody who's writing code mostly on the front end of things. So they might be programming the HTML or JavaScript for the website. And they're a little bit rare too, because if you're a developer, you really have to know the technology very well. And sometimes that is a bit at odds with the user's experience, where they're not thinking about the technology. So a UX developer might be a programmer with some background or some knowledge of user experience, or maybe they've taken some training. But I think it's generally better to have them as separate roles and to just communicate really well. Okay, a few more. Would a product manager be the one communicating mostly with clients? In general, yes. The product manager's job is to understand what the customer wants, so what their goals are. So they might not be communicating with them directly, or maybe they're communicating with, say, the salespeople at the organization that they're trying to sell to, but they should be the ones who are passing along the requirements for the product to the designer. So sometimes they might, but sometimes the client, the person purchasing the product, is not going to be the one using it. So that's where a user researcher can come in really handy, is that they're actually usually talking to the customers of the product, who may not be the ones who are buying it. So product managers, they're representing the business case a little bit more, and so they're focused a little bit more on the features. But it's very important to have a good relationship with a product manager. And it can be a little different in, say, an agency setting. So if you're working for a design agency, there might not be a product manager. There might be somebody who's more kind of a lead facilitator or a liaison. But within an in-house organization, it's going to be a product manager. What is a UX engineer and how common is the job? That title isn't used as much anymore. Once you get into UX, you'll realize how much conversation there is about job titles and how often it changes. UX engineer, I think, was maybe originated to give a little bit more credibility to what user experience designers did, because for a long time there was this understanding that all we did was do the visual design. So adding the term engineer in there kind of gave it some more credibility and showed that it was a valid role within a software organization. But I don't see that term used as much anymore. If you're a UX engineer, maybe you're working at a large company, or there's a little bit of an antiquated UX process, or maybe you're doing some programming or something like that. So it might be kind of like a UX developer, but it's better to look at the job description and talk to the company if you want to find out what the role actually is, because there's a lot of jobs that are going to be advertised for a UX something, and they can mean very different things even with the same title. So the titles are always changing. A couple of other questions here. Would you recommend any of the UX challenge sites in particular? Those can be good for people who don't have experience. The problem always, of course, with experience is that if you don't have experience, you can't get the experience, and you can't get the experience if you don't have the experience. So that's why it can be good to go through some kind of online training program, because they almost always have some kind of portfolio project. And portfolios are really important for getting hired. So finding a way to work on a real project is a really good thing. Some of the UX challenges can be a little idealistic and not so real world. So maybe you're the one coming up with the app idea, or how would you solve this problem, when in reality, oftentimes that's kind of handed to you by the product manager. So it can be useful to do a volunteer project, maybe where you're working on a real project and you understand what it's like to work with real people. But UX challenges can be useful just to get you different experience working on different types of challenges. A few more. Is it okay to end up changing drastically low fidelity wireframes after drawing high fidelity wireframes? That's what happens to my design. I'm rethinking. So it's nice to stay in low fidelity phase for a while so that you can come up with lots of different ideas in that phase, because if you move to the high fidelity phase too fast, you might kind of too attached to the design. You might say, oh, I like how this looks, and then you might start going down that direction, or people might start commenting on the visual appearance, and then you kind of lose sight of the workflow and the usability. So I think it's nice to spend a lot of time in that low fidelity phase. If you are changing things too much at the high fidelity phase, then that could be okay, but I think it's also then good to kind of circle back to what are the goals here. Does this modified, updated design still match the goals? And moving things around, say from one side of the screen to another, that might not affect the experience very much. So it depends if you're making visual changes or if it's kind of fundamentally changing the interaction. So of course I would say it depends, but in general I would say it's good to spend a lot of time in that low fidelity phase. Looking at a few more questions here. What are some of the technical skills that are complementary to UX that are valuable today or in the future? The good news is that UX is so broad now, and there's so many different industries, that any other skill set that you have can be useful. So that's a really good way to position yourself and pitch yourself when you're looking for jobs, is what else are you good at? What else do you have a background in that you can kind of use to sell yourself? So if you have an English degree, you can say, I'm a really good writer, and then that might pair you well for a UX job that's, say, working on a lot of marketing materials. Or maybe you have a background in marketing or business. That's something that's a really useful skill to have. I read recently about this idea of the pie-shaped person, which is kind of where you have a broad knowledge of certain things, and then you have kind of two semi-deep areas, or one area that's deep and one area that's a little less deep. So that deep area would be UX design. But if you have one other skill, that's really good. So maybe it's programming, maybe it's search engine optimization, certain web technologies. I found, for example, that having knowledge of CSS is really useful, because you're working with programmers who are thinking about the back end, and they're thinking, people who think about databases and stuff generally aren't very good at working on some of the front end visual layout things. So if you have one other skill that's used within the software industry, that can be really useful, and definitely play that up in your interview or your application, or try to find a role where you know that that's a part of the role as well. That's definitely going to help you, because like I said, a lot of the time you're not doing design, and the more you can understand either your users or the business case or the people who are going to be building it, the better you're able to fit into that role. Another question on certain certificate programs, the new Google UX Design Certificate Program on Coursera, they made it, I think they made it free or very affordable, and it's kind of a good way to get access to a high quality education program that's not expensive and that's very available. I read an article about it recently that had a good review of it. I haven't done it myself. I would just say, like any other program, just going through a program is not going to automatically get you a job. You really have to find a way to demonstrate your skills, but it is a known name. It's certainly a good thing to do if you have the time, and especially because it's free or inexpensive. But one thing I think is really good when you're doing an educational program is find one that pairs you with some kind of mentor, somebody who's in the industry, because networking, like for all jobs, it can be a huge part of landing that job. So if you're just working a little bit too much at a distance, you might not get as much of an idea of what it's like working in the real world. But if you're starting from scratch, just to have an idea of what some of the projects are like, it can be really useful. But you might want to supplement with something else, or reach out to somebody. I mean, networking or working on a real world projects is going to be really, really useful. A couple other questions. Any advice or tips to people who are kind of late in the game, who are starting this later in their career? You know, I addressed some of that earlier. Like I said, I would really try to play up any experience that you do have, because it's probably more valuable than you realize. And if you've worked in software industry at all and have an understanding of how that works, I mean, for a lot of UX designers, new UX designers, that first year is really learning all about how the software industry works, and trying to reconcile the differences between what they learned in school and what it's like in the real world. So there's probably a lot, you know, anybody who's worked in any industry for a long time knows about how to work with people, how to negotiate, probably has really good soft skills. I mean, unfortunately, those are a little hard to demonstrate in an application. They might shine more in an interview if you get to that phase, but you know, try to find something that you're really good at, that somebody who's younger might not have. And I think some maturity would definitely come across. And so it's not necessarily a young person's game. Like maybe, you know, programming might be a little bit more catered to somebody who's, you know, fresh out of school and young. But, you know, I'm older, and I think I'm still pretty good at the role. So I don't think that being older or coming from a different industry should prevent you from being good at the job. But, you know, as always, for anybody, you're going to have to work hard to make yourself stand out. But the advantage is that you probably know yourself well, and you know kind of what you like and what you're good at. And so make sure that you spend a lot of time kind of pitching yourself, or trying to find a way to make clear what it is that makes you stand out. Another person mentioned the Interaction Design Foundation. IDF is a really great resource. They have a fantastic website with tons of articles, a lot of free material, and then they also have courses. I've taken several of them, and I can definitely recommend them. Another question. Okay, this one I think I looked at already. Let me see. I think I have a few. What about the social aspect of UX? You know, if you're kind of more of an introverted person or extroverted, what are some of the different roles? I think, you know, I'm an introvert, and I think being a UX designer is well suited to that. You know, you have to be able to communicate really well with people. You have to have good skills for communicating within your organization, at least. So you don't necessarily need to be really good with all people, but it's really good to develop good relationships. An extrovert, I think all the user researchers I've worked with are extroverts. So you have to listen to people talk about, you know, talk on the phone about their experiences, and they want to. A big part of your job is making people feel comfortable and sometimes just listening to them talk about things that you're not interested, but still keeping them engaged. So it's good to be a people person if you're a user researcher, I would say. But as far as a UX designer, I think it can take a bunch of different personality types. Some questions about creating a portfolio. That's a very hot topic in UX. And I think we have some resources on our website, and you'll find a lot of people talking about it. And there's some controversial topics, whether you need one, what should be in it. So I would do your research on that. But I think the most important thing is just find a way to convey what your message is. People don't want to just look through projects. They want to know what your contribution was and try to picture how you would fit into their organization. So spend a lot of time on the words that you use and not just showing pictures, because those are kind of easy to make look nice, but you really need to inject a story in there. And mentors, there's a couple of sites that I mentioned, volunteer work. Some of it might be local, or if there's some organizations that you're already involved with. I don't have any off the top of my head. I have done some mentoring. I've done mentoring as part of a UX design course, and just a little bit of volunteer mentoring. So if you're interested, reach out to me. I might have time for taking on 1 or 2 mentors, depending on the commitment and length of time. But it's something I've done before. It's something I enjoy doing. So feel free to reach out to me. And if I'm not able to do it, I might be able to recommend somebody. Yeah, maybe that's all the questions that I'm seeing. If you have other questions, feel free to ask in the Q&A or the chat. We sound like a great bunch of people. Thank you. We do enjoy, spreading the word about UX design and helping people, like you, develop and create better products for people. We're all very frustrated with the software that's hard to use. So we want to do our part to make software easier to use for everyone. And I think a user experience it's a great role. It's a fun job. I've been doing, been involved in some way or another in user experience for over 15 years now. It's a job that you can continue learning with, and it's so far it's been a really good way to stay employed, which is nice, because a lot of jobs you can't say that. So even though a lot of industries change, UX is really being adopted by all kinds of industries, which is really good because there's software everywhere, or a website at least, or an app or something like that. So having somebody who understands the user is able to kind of bridge that gap between the business side and the technical side, I think is a role that will be needed for a very, very long time. All right, well, with that, we are at time. So I will end this, and then please keep an eye on our website for the recording, and I'll put all of those links in there as well. And definitely check out our page on advice for getting started in UX. That has a lot of good starting resources as well. And feel free to reach out to me or my colleague Billy afterwards with other specific questions. So thank you very much.